Hello and welcome to our celebration of Brigid's Day by the Consulates General of Ireland across Britain, based in Cardiff, Edinburgh and Manchester. Anish Choctanari. Today we mark the first day of spring, as celebrated in the ancient festival of Imbolc and long associated with Brigid. We're delighted that you're joining with us this evening to celebrate the creativity of women. Is mór an onóir doing bheith an ocht, chun ceannaireacht agus cruthaíocht na man a chéiliúra. We'll be hearing shortly from four great women whose creativity flourishes in the sphere of communication across the arts and media, and whose work contributes richly to the relationship between our two countries. Tonight's event is just one part of celebrating Brigid across Britain this year, and you can find out the international events for Brigid's Day this year on tobeirish.ie. As we take the celebration of Brigid global, we do hope that you'll be inspired by her and her legacy and by our four guests this evening.
So, who was Brigid? Firstly, she was a fabulous pagan goddess with varying responsibilities, many of which she held on to when her traditions were later adopted by Christianity. For those of you less familiar with her, let's quickly recap just some of this amazing woman's associations. Brigid was responsible for women in childbirth, children born outside of marriage, and women and children in abusive relationships. She was a healer. She's considered a guardian of cattle and dairy and agricultural fertility. Brigid was the battle goddess of Leinster. She looked after smithcraft and brewing, introducing the art of making beer to Ireland. Brigid devised a special way of whistling for women to call out when travelling alone in the dark, an early personal alarm. Brigid's crosses will be familiar to anyone who went to school in Ireland, woven of river rushes and kept at home to protect the house from fire. And fire remains associated with Brigid. Her flame burns in the centre of Kildare to this day, and you can visit her fire temple in the grounds of her cathedral there too, where small offerings are often left. Brigid's cloak is said to protect Ireland from harsh weather, and when she shakes it out, the seasons change. Brigid is also the goddess and guide of craft and creativity.
While Brigid will mean different things to all of us, that she encompasses cultivation, creativity and care remains constant. The women who will meet this evening represent these strengths and values in their fields of work and their broader lives, and we hope that you will find them as inspiring as we do. Our discussion this evening will be moderated by journalist Ellen Coyne, who writes for the Irish Independent and is the author of the book Are You There, God? It's Me, Ellen. Joining Ellen, we have Sorcha Carey, current director of Edinburgh Art Festival and chair of Festivals Edinburgh, and incoming director of Collective, the Centre for Contemporary Art in Edinburgh. Bethan Kilfoil, news editor with RTE and former BBC Wales correspondent, and Emma Smith, director of the Liverpool Irish Festival and former executive director of Look Liverpool International Photography Festival. So thank you to our fabulous Irish and British women, and those of you with a foot in each camp, for joining us tonight in a spirit of creativity, of generosity, of sisterhood. I'm going to hand over now to Ellen Coyne and our other guests for the evening, who represent first and foremost themselves, but also the spirit of Brigid in their careers in the arts and media.
Hello everybody and welcome to our panel. I want to wish everybody a very happy St. Brigid's Day if you're joining us in Ireland, Britain or anywhere else across the globe. I don't know about the rest of our guests, but I'm certainly very intimidated having to live up to Brigid and her fantastic list of achievements, but we'll do our best to kind of honour her and pay tribute to her today. I know that after the last couple of years, a lot of us were probably having Zoom fatigue, but I think that today the platform has come into its own because it's going to facilitate a really fascinating, brilliant discussion between three brilliant women based in Ireland, Scotland and England. So while being conscious of that, I'm going to try to keep my role to an absolute minimum, because I know that we're going to have plenty to say and plenty to get on with. I think that it would be very rude of me to start anywhere except discussing Brigid herself. And I know Bethan, like Brigid, is also a woman based in Kildare. So I thought, Bethan, it might be most appropriate to maybe start with you. I know that this year, St. Brigid's Day feels very different. It feels like not just in Ireland, but across the world, belatedly, we're kind of honouring her in the way that maybe she should have been honoured before. She's kind of had to live in poor St. Patrick's shadow for quite a while, but we're kind of belatedly kind of giving her a voice and honouring her. And I'm just wondering what this year St. Brigid's Day means for you.
Yeah, it's great. And we're going to get a St. Brigid's Day national holiday from next year on. So that's great. Finally, St. gets the, you know, the sort of the time and honour that she deserves. And she's been in the shadow of St. Patrick really all this time. St. Patrick's got all the glory, all the publicity and all the crack. And finally, St. Brigid, like, it's kind of, I was just thinking in a way, you know, it's sort of virgin territory in a way, because, you know, we do celebrate St. Brigid's Day, especially in Kildare, in the schools, the primary schools, they still make the St. Brigid's crosses. And, you know, we've got a couple hanging in the house as well. But really, apart from that, you know, we've never had a celebration, national celebration on the day itself. So that'll be great. Yeah, I was kind of thinking as well, you know, she's been in the shadow of St. Patrick all this time. And there's a saint in Wales as well, Santes Dwynwen, Saint Dwynwen, and she's a sort of, instead of Valentine's Day, Saint Valentine, she's the goddess or the patron saint of lovers in Wales. And that's becoming more and more celebrated in Wales. I mean, it always has been a day. She was a princess in the 4th, 5th century, and she was, as you know, it's a bit of a trope, but she was, you know, unlucky in love. She was supposed to marry, her father was a king, she was to marry somebody else. She was in love with somebody else. He got turned into a block of ice, and she got 3 wishes. One was that he should be melted, which happened. The other that God would protect all lovers. And the third was that she would never marry. And so she went off and founded a convent, just like St. Brigid. So yeah, it's great to finally give St. Brigid the honour she deserves.
Yeah, and I think, Sorcha, I just wanted to ask you as well, because I know reading up on St. Brigid, she is obviously one of our patron saints, but she's always had kind of a Celtic element to her, and a lot of her kind of stories have brought in Scotland as well. And I'm just wondering, I mean, would you kind of feel the same, that maybe we could all do with a day that, I know in Ireland it's our first public holiday that will be named after a woman, and I wonder, like, do you see kind of merits there in having a day where we maybe have, I was going to say an excuse, an opportunity is probably more the appropriate word, to kind of honour women as well?
Absolutely. And I mean, I think it's amazing when we were hearing the introduction about Brigid, I feel like I'm learning so much about her as a Celtic goddess and as a saint, and feel, you know, that my job is very small compared to hers. But I suppose one of the things that I was really struck by was the qualities that she's embodying, and they're qualities that I think we all could learn from, in terms of as someone who's deeply caring, holding vulnerable lives, I suppose, in her spirit strength, but also a goddess really of creativity. Here in Edinburgh, we have, amazingly, in the castle in Edinburgh, you climb up the very, very steep hill and the very steep steps, and actually at the very top, you find a little medieval chapel to St. Margaret. And that was, I think for many years, it was very, very overlooked. In the 19th century, I think it was being used as somewhere to store armory. And then they rediscovered it, and they really, really started to really celebrate her legacy as well. So I think the more that we can do to kind of bring these kind of overlooked histories and voices, you know, into public consciousness, and that we can all learn more and celebrate these stories, the better.
I think that's such a great point about overlooked voices. And I suppose, unfortunately, all of us will be familiar that anytime we talk about women's voices or women's roles, there's nearly a constant theme of talking about people who haven't been given an opportunity to speak before, or maybe have had their voices marginalized or sidelined. And I think, Emma, that kind of brings you in nicely, because I know that you have been doing a lot of work on invisible women, and you've also been trying retrospectively to give a voice to a lot of Irish women whose experience here was industrial, in mother and baby homes, you know, when they were basically punished by society, specifically as women on a basis of gender discrimination. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that project?
Sure, thank you. Essentially, we began Invisible Women as a direct response to two things that happened, actually. One was that I was assaulted, and the other was that in working with Irishness, I kept hearing this idea that Ireland was a matriarchal state, and thinking, this doesn't bear out in the culture and the creativity and the names that I keep hearing. So where are they? Where are these matriarchs that don't seem to be given voices in the passages of literature in the playwrights that we hear about? And so we started to kind of uncover these voices. And of course, I was quite heavily charged with this idea of really having faced a kind of a physical attack in my gender, really thinking, well, what do I do about this then? So it became a kind of creative pursuit to unveil these voices, very much in the spirit of what you were saying about St. Brigid and that idea of her trying to help people heal who had come through abuse. So we started looking at particular dual heritage lives that we never really hear about. Liverpool has this incredible history of Irish Chinese communities and Black and Irish communities. And when we looked at Black Irish and Googled that even, it's all about white people. So where are the Black people within Ireland's history? So we sort of started to unpick these things and talk to our community about who they were, where were they, how had they landed in Liverpool, and what was their experience of Irishness today? Did it feature in their life, or as something that was in itself invisible because the kind of cultural markers for that are not necessarily so visibly evident? So we've done all sorts of work around that, and then we were so fortunate to work with Miriam Horton over at the National University of Ireland in Galway, who had set up the Tuam oral history projects around the mother and baby care homes. And of course, when the inquiry came out, it virtually omitted all of the oral testimony that they had actually resourced and people had given their time over to. And so we made a concerted effort as part of the festival to have an Invisible Women Day, and we worked with them to create a series of sessions that helped tell those stories and communicate the personal testimony and experience of people so that we could bear witness to them and to really sort of get a sense of the personal endeavour and the fight that people have had since then, and to try and make that more not real for everybody else, but as I say, really as a testimony to that, to bear witness to their suffering and to really give them a platform to be heard.
I'm so struck there listening to you kind of talk about your own experience of assault, which I'm so sorry to hear about, and tying it in with what sometimes can almost be a nearly universal experience of a woman, of, you know, elements of trauma or elements of assault, and finding that creative way to look at that, whether it was your own personal experience or the traumatic history of women who'd been through those institutions. And it does kind of tie in with St. Brigid again, because there's an element of creativity which she has kind of been a patron of. And Sorcha, speaking about creativity, you know, I'd be interested to hear your point of view on, you know, when people like Emma are using creative ways to talk about the experience of being a woman, or creative ways to talk about our past. Do you find yourself, with your own experience with contemporary art and visual art, is that sometimes a way to kind of to put words on things that women particularly otherwise might struggle to talk about?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think it can provide a really helpful space for thinking and for thinking about difficult things and complex things and very nuanced feelings and emotions, and the way that our individual lives kind of intersect with broader society. I was very struck actually listening to Sarah speaking just about that sense in which I think there's a real kind of collective sense of a need to find ways in which we can make some of these voices more visible in our societies and in the cities that we're living in. And in Edinburgh, we've been having a very live conversation here about the public realm in Edinburgh. We have probably 160 plus statues in Edinburgh. And famously, there are more animals commemorated in Edinburgh than women. There's a statue of Queen Victoria, and I think there's one or two other, but generally it's a very, very masculine landscape standing up there on the pedestal. So we actually in 2016, we had a program of commissions where we were thinking about monuments in the city and who and what we remember, and inviting contemporary artists to think about that. And we were lucky enough to do an amazing project with the Irish-Canadian artist Ciara Phillips, who worked with us to remember the history of dazzle ships. Dazzle ships were these amazing kind of like almost, you know, very abstract designs that were painted on ships in the First World War in an attempt to kind of camouflage them or make them difficult to kind of read. And apparently Picasso, when he saw a photograph of a dazzle ship, he said, "I invented that." But in fact, Ciara discovered that there was this entire department of dazzle painters in the Royal Academy who were in fact all women. And they were all coming up with these amazing designs for these ships, and of course have been completely written out of the history. So it was wonderful to work with her in a way to think about that and to honor those roles in this amazing project that she made on this 75-meter long ship down in the port of Leith.
That's fantastic. That is so interesting. And I was really struck there when you were talking about the public spaces in Edinburgh, because I know certainly the situation over here in Ireland is that so many of our kind of big national streets are all named after men. All of the statues are men. And I mean, when I'm thinking of statues of women in Dublin, the first thing I'm thinking of is kind of Molly Malone and her very impressive cleavage nonetheless. But I mean, it's not exactly the only monument to women that we should have. And Bethan, I mean, we were hardly short of heroic women either through the Rising or throughout Irish history that kind of could have been marked and could have those monuments to them in our public spaces. And I'm wondering, do you think over the last kind of couple of decades in Ireland, even leading up to the fact that we finally are commemorating St. Brigid's Day properly, we've had a lot of catching up to do in terms of celebrating women and giving them a space to talk. But are you confident that Ireland is kind of in a good place at the moment in terms of in recognising women and giving them a platform?
Well, in a much better place anyway, because I mean, not only, you know, women not celebrated, I mean, there was sort of, actually kind of kept down and punished, and, as, Emma was talking there about the mother and baby homes, that's the history, and it's the history that we're have been confronting and bringing out into the open and admitting what went on and what was colluded with really by everybody. It's a good, healthy thing to do that, but there is a long way to go because, as we know, a lot of those women are still waiting for compensation, and they're getting older and they're still fighting their battles really. And I was just thinking actually, as Sorcha was talking about statues, women in public places, and Emma referring to the Black Irish women, and in Cardiff there was a statue unveiled recently of Betty Campbell, who was a Black Welsh woman who was a teacher in the docks in Cardiff, which of course, there's a great sort of tradition of a great community that has been there for years in Cardiff. And she was, I think, certainly the first Black Welsh woman to have a statue, but I think she's the first woman in Wales to have a statue in a public place. I mean, there are statues, but I think they're sort of, private ones, in outside big houses and that sort of thing. But as in a civic statue put up on the streets of Cardiff. So maybe it's something that, all the cities are beginning to, you know, to come to terms with and put out in the open, literally in public spaces.
Yep, I completely agree with you. And I think, Emma, I know that thinking about the way that we've spoken about women over the last couple of years and their roles kind of ties in with what you were saying at the start about this this idea of Ireland as a matriarchal society. And I know that during COVID, I kind of felt like that matriarchal voice was oddly absent at the start, at the time when there was a disproportionate burden on a lot of women. You know, creches were closed, schools were closed, and women were still kind of having to be almost like St. Brigid, this sort of Swiss Army knife that has to do everything and, you know, perform a multitude of roles. And I'm interested in kind of coming back to you on what you were saying at the start about that role of women in society as caregivers or as matriarchs. I mean, do you think that that is something that we also need to go back to and kind of look again and see if there's more of a space to hear from women themselves about that sort of experience?
My concern around the terminology of using matriarch for Irishness as a society is that I think it's a bit of gaslighting. I think it's kind of a cover for it being, or having had been, quite a patriarchal society when you think about church and state and how those mother and baby homes were sort of pushed into a position and how women were kind of made to abuse one another under those systems of governance. I think that is a thing that still needs to be reconciled, and I recognise that reconciliation is itself messy and compromising, but I think that process is currently underway, but still very slowly. I think that idea that we are going to have to own up to these practices and to our own being cajoled into those positions. You know, hurt people hurt, and I think we created a lot of systems that continued sort of collective cultural harm. So I think we're sort of trying to unpick an awful lot of that, and it folds into wars, it folds into arts and creativity and the lack of prominence of women in those positions. So there's so much to unpick there. And it's funny that at the start of COVID, we didn't hear very many women, but we probably didn't want to be put at the front of that to keep on telling people to wash their hands and clean their faces and put their masks on, because essentially that's what we have been doing all this time. But I think for a long time, women have been the maintainers of culture and of creativity and of oral histories and of family lines and of genealogy. And I think there's something fascinating in that we're really trying with Invisible Women to sort of unfurl and see more, because it isn't that we haven't been there and it isn't that we haven't spoken. You know, the first MP was Constance Markovits. Really, why don't we hear about her more often? Actually, the fact that she was in prison when she earned that role democratically is something that really needs to be challenged. And when we think about that role as a maintainer or as a St. Bridget, as a battle goddess, I think was the phrase that was used about her earlier. You know, these are incredibly contemporary women who can teach us ever such a lot about our time today, as well as what came before. So I'm fascinated in it, and in this idea of picking apart matriarchy and whether or not that's really a strength, or if it is actually the name of the stick we've used to beat ourselves with.
And Sorcha, I saw you nodding there. Would you kind of agree with that idea of women, as Emma said, being the maintainers of creative spaces and creativity?
Well, I think it's been very interesting, actually, just thinking about even in the field of contemporary art, that there's a lot of work now being made that's really thinking about care and giving care, and also thinking about the materials and the processes of making as ways in which you can kind of make some of that invisibility and those structures visible. So we worked with an artist last year called Kirsty Russell, who's based in Aberdeen, and she was in our festival program in a platform that we have for artists at the beginning of their careers to support them to make work. And she has an amazing practice where she works with textiles, and she's really interested in the way in which, and by making visible the bits of textiles that we normally hide, like the seams and the gussets and the kind of, you know, when you make a tufted rug, you know, the back side of the rug is normally covered with a piece of cloth. By bringing that visibly into her sculptures, into her textile sculptures, and making them at the front, she's also finding a way in which she can sort of make visible those structures that are holding things. And, you know, that comes partly from her own sort of lived experience experience of doing a lot of work in caregiving roles in schools and in hospitals, but also, of course, is something that I think we've all really been reflecting on very deeply as a society because of the experience that we've been living through over the last 2 years as well.
And one thing I just thinking about that, you know, if you think about it, for creativity, for women or for anybody to be creative, you need time, you need space, you actually also need money. Usually you need to be able to have the power to do that. And you know, if you think about St. Brigid, I was just thinking about it there, you know, the legend of Brigid is, you know, she had this cloak and she was told, you can have the land that cloak covers. And she said, yeah, okay. So she flung her cloak out and it magically grew really, really big in the whole of Kildare. But, you know, there's an idea there about space and, you know, and owning that space. I mean, you know, that's territory and land, which to them was money and power. And, you know, there is an element of that as well, which I think St. Brigid symbolises as well, the taking of power and space and territory.
I love that. I don't know like how anyone else feels about it, but I know that it's kind of a taboo thing or things that people don't encourage. But when I'm listening to a woman who's really successful creatively, maybe it's like someone who's written a book, I know it's kind of discouraged sometimes to ask women, how do you find the time, or you know, who looks after the kids? But I actually sometimes find I'm really interested in those answers because I don't know how other people do it, because like you said, Bethan, it's really expensive, whether it's expensive in terms of time or whether it's expensive in terms of money. And I actually would like to hear a woman talk about how she managed to do it, because it often is unfortunately, maybe because she might be better off than other people are. And I don't know if any of the rest of you would kind of agree with that, or if you would kind of take the view that maybe we shouldn't be asking women those questions. I don't know. I'm just kind of interested to hear what you think.
Or Emma.
I can go after you.
No, you go first.
So one of the things that I had thought about as we were sort of all talking was this idea of women as artists, because that's relatively modern. Because what happened, and this kind of does come back to the money aspect of things, was that women were applied artists. We did crafts. So we were always makers. We clothed our children. We dress made, we did all of those things that had creative aspects. We weren't really allowed into the high places of art where the academia of it was sort of discussed and where the principles were laid out. But you know, embroidery, wicker weaving, all of these things are incredible creative practices, but that weren't held up in sort of high regard because they were also practical. And so quite often the money and the practicality come together to reinforce that creativity is happening, but it sort of it maybe diminishes it in terms of what the public view of it is. So I think there's a real thing that's come out of COVID, that people have returned to a lot of these crafts as a means of passing time differently. So I think we might see an effect in the art world of textiles coming back in and up to the fore, and ceramics and jewellery making and silversmithing and all of these other things that sort of previously were perhaps combining form and function and allowing creativity to take place at home. That's sort of my hope. But in terms of whether or not we should ask women, if we don't, we'll not know.
Sorry, did you come in there? Yeah,
I was just going to say that I think that in some ways maybe it's less about feeling whether we should ask women about that or not. I mean, I think quite often, you know, we all have so many positive female role models in our own individual lives. I know I could list, at least 5 women who have been absolutely critical for me. But I think for me, it's more maybe about thinking about how can we put in place the conditions to create that space for more women and, to create that space in society for that thinking and that creativity to happen. And I think both at a a very practical level in terms of, the provisions that society is offering in terms of childcare, changing attitudes to, how we collectively raise children as a society, for example. But then also in our own individual areas of work, I mean, at the festival, we're trying to, always create opportunities for artists to be supported and paid to make work, so that we can play our role in helping to develop an economy that can actually support creativity financially, as much as providing a space to share that creativity with audiences.
I think that's so interesting what you said there about creating a framework where women can actually do the work that we want to do. And I know that we've all, fingers crossed, are kind of coming out of this pandemic. I mean, Bethan, do you think that society will actually learn from the last couple of years about, the importance of having childcare available, about the unpaid or sometimes unrecognized work that so many women are doing? And I suppose sometimes it feels like it does not matter how accomplished you are, or how ambitious you are, or how successful you are. If you are a woman, it's very hard to kind of empower yourself out of that unpaid work and that disproportionate burden that seems to fall on you no matter what you do.
Yeah, I mean, during the pandemic, I mean, so many women, I don't know how they did it, because the whole being stuck at home and, running the risk of sickness and illness, having to homeschool the children, having to try and do your own work at the same time if you were trying to do that. I mean, there's an awful lot of juggling, and even more juggling went on during the pandemic for a lot of women. And it'll be interesting to see how much of the hybrid working and the home working thing carries on after the pandemic. And is that a good thing, or is it, not altogether a good thing? Because, we all know going to work and going into a space where you can work and being able to divide your life is as important as having the flexibility to be at home and look after your children, whatever. That there are a lot of lessons, and it's not clear yet what those lessons are, and what the good bits are that we should carry on with, and whether we will do that. It will be very interesting to see.
I wanted to ask you another question, because I was thinking of you and I suppose your profession and your work when Sorcha was talking there about that. Sounds like a stunning project where we kind of take the time to look at the seams or the underbelly or beneath the fold, because I'm conscious that there is so much female on-air broadcast talent in Ireland at the moment, thank God. But I'm conscious that anytime I go into a newsroom, the kind of production side, the kind of wheels that kind of keep things turning, traditionally you would have had a lot of women in those sorts of unseen roles. And I think that you must have such an interesting perspective on how we get women in front of the camera now, whether it's on the journalism side as presenters, or whether it's kind of struggling to get women to talk for industries that traditionally wouldn't have been represented by women, whether that's business or those kind of male-dominated fields. I'd just be really interested to hear what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting and very, very important, because, we were all talking about invisible women and voices that don't get heard. And in my job, we're at the coal face of that, because that is, women on television, on the news and other programs, and on the air, on radio. And it's really important that you have a range of female voices on different topics, and that, that society is reflected in what you see on the screen and what you hear on the airwaves. We have, a colleague of mine in RT, Roisin Duffy, she's involved in an organisation called Women on Air, which is, they've done research, they've sort of monitored programmes on radio and television to see how many women are visible and audible, and, topics that are covered. And they have looked at, because if you don't have the research and the facts, you can't proceed from that then on. So they've done research, and they've also set up a database of women who are confident and happy and willing to be interviewed on various subjects. I mean, there are certain fields, as you were saying there, Alan, finance is one, legal issues is another. Now, women, it's much easier to get women spokespeople or women to be interviewed in social affairs in those sort of areas. But when it comes to, and the pandemic was a classic point, because that's kind of quite science, it's traditionally quite male heavy. And there were times, sometimes in the pandemic, you'd look at, as you were saying earlier about washing your hands, the people up there telling us what to do were men. But actually, as things progressed, there are a lot of women experts out there. And, we had women scientists, the head of NIAC, which is the National Immunisation, the body that advises on that. She's a woman, Dr. Karina Butler. So really, really prominent, extremely, qualified, talented, great women to have on to explain. And, they're there, but it's a question of the people who put programs together, thinking that way and looking for them. And those women, were well able to do it, but there are a lot of women who don't feel necessarily confident. And Women on Air, the project, part of it is to help those women who maybe think, oh, I don't know about that, I don't know about going on the radio, even though I know about my topic. It's helping them navigate all that and having the confidence to do it. Because, one thing you do find is that some women feel they have to know absolutely everything about whatever it is they've got to talk about before they'll go on and talk about it. So it's, it's a question of confidence and visibility, and then, a chicken and egg situation then, because the more people see women on air talking about things or listen to them, then the more that becomes the norm.
There's a really interesting thing around that. It's called the Bechdel test, which is where it's like an informal way where you can look at female representation. How much time is spent on screen? How much time are they spending talking about things that actually matter towards the plot, rather than just being sort of I've forgotten the word for it, but sort of just paying face to the idea that they're there, so it is about women and we are being inclusive. So it's a really interesting sort of metric that people are using. Just sort of throw that in there. There's also this interesting piece of research that suggests that women are far less likely to go for a job unless they match a minimum of 80% of the criteria there, whereas men will go for a job matching only 50% of the criteria. So I think this idea of how we see ourselves on screen and this idea of having meaningful interactions between women on screen is also informing our language and our confidence, exactly as you were saying, Bethan. So I think, conversations like this are really important, where we can see that we can be masters in certain amounts of our field. You don't have to be experts in everything in order to have a presence, to be engaged, to be an ally, and to support other women and men really well in this world.
I remember when I was little, I was, I loved Blue Peter. And I remember I'd sit there and I'd wait till all the end credits had gone. And then you'd see Biddy Baxter, who was the editor of Blue Peter, at the end. And normally any programmes that you saw, they were usually men's names at the very end, who sort of, you thought, well, that's the person who's really in charge of it. And it's a man's name. And then Biddy Baxter, I thought, this Biddy Baxter must be amazing. It turns out she was amazing, but, those things matter as well, seeing the names there.
We went on a training course recently with Claw, who said that 60% of board members in England are called John. I mean, that's ferociously high, isn't it?
That's very high. That is very high.
I mean, it's ridiculous. In a sense, it's ridiculous, but also it shows that we need to be getting ourselves into those rooms and at those tables and having those discussions. Not because there's anything wrong with Johns, but because Jeans are great as well, and Brenda's, and all of us. So we need to get that mixed up a little bit.
Yeah, and I'm thinking, like, as you're talking, I know when I was reading up on your work, Sorcha, like something that came up a lot was how when you were kind of curating the festival and putting it together, there were so many women included, whether it was just included in general or when you were making spaces for kind of people who were up and coming. And I'm wondering, how did you do that? Because there's certainly plenty of other festivals around Ireland or around the world that might be able to take a few tips from you.
Oh, well, it didn't feel difficult, I have to say, because there's so many great women artists out there. And actually, the truth is that there are a great many women working in visual art as well, and increasingly so. And so, in fact, I was in great company and also had great material to work with. But also, it felt really important. It felt really important to share that work and to honor, I suppose we do a lot of programming which is about contemporary art practice, and there's an enormous amount of contemporary artists who are female and who are making excellent work. So to share that with audiences and to kind of bring those perspectives within our platform does feel really important, especially as a woman.
And I'm conscious when you're talking, or when we're all talking really, about the female voice, something that has that women have kind of had to deal with a lot is you know, kind of watching our tone or watching the way that we say certain things, particularly if it's something that we're passionate about. And I know it comes up a lot in the media, but I'm interested in asking you, Sorcha, like, is there a freedom for women in art where, because it's so creative, because it doesn't have to be quite so literal, that there's a freedom of expression that maybe we wouldn't have if we were trying to be creative or trying to communicate in a different medium?
Oh, wow, that's a big question. And I'm not sure. I mean, it makes me think of quite a few things. I mean, I was very, very struck when Bethan was speaking about that immediate kind of sense of a sort of almost self-imposed kind of higher bar of sort of feeling that you have to be an expert to actually kind of speak, you know, to be able to be allowed to speak. I wonder if, I mean, clearly, I suppose within the process of making contemporary art, or making any art, I think there's two things that happen. There's the individual process of making and trying to find your own authentic voice, and the freedom that you have and that you would give yourself as an artist through that process of thinking and making and producing something that you feel genuinely is the work that you want to produce. And then, of course, there's the moment that work goes beyond you and actually is encountered by audiences, or indeed represented in the media. And I suppose that's sometimes where you can find, obviously, that a single authentic voice is being responded to in a whole range of different ways. So I suppose I would hope that all artists feel that they, I mean, at least we're privileged, I suppose, to live in the West, where there is a great degree of freedom for artists to express themselves and to make work that they can then show publicly. Of course, that is not the case the world over, and we shouldn't forget that either.
And Bethan, I'd be interested in kind of getting your perspective on you know, talking there about women having the freedom to kind of to use their voice. I don't know if it would be something that you'd have direct experience of, but I'm conscious that there's a lot of attention recently on the fact that working in the media sometimes as a woman, unfortunately for some, depending on what you might cover, might come with more hassle than it's worth in terms of increasing elements of online abuse against journalists. And I know that we're kind of living in a society now where, rather than being a journalist for RTE or a journalist for the Irish Independent, because of social media, you kind of have your kind of a personality or an individual in your own right. And it seems like that's bringing a disproportionate problem for women who seem to be getting the lion's share of online abuse, and very, very personal, aggressive abuse that kind of threatens our safety.
Yeah, it's awful. I mean, I personally haven't had much experience of that, but then I'm not on air. I mean, I used to be a reporter, but not on air now. But it's awful. It's horrific, and it's all very well telling, women and anybody else who gets online abuse to, don't take any notice of it, just try and block it out. It's all very well, but it's very, very hard to do that, because, they know how to get at you and really hurt you. So yeah, it's a problem, and I don't know what can be done about it, really. It's very hard for women.
So is that something that Emma or Sorcha, that you've kind of come across in your own fields as well?
Marginally, but very marginally. Fortunately for me, I feel very grateful that I haven't encountered that, but certainly I know of artists that have struggled with that, and it's an impossible thing to help as well, because anybody that you speak to rationally would say, well, that's ridiculous, who would do that? And none of us feel like we know anybody who would do that. but somebody's doing that. So it's all very well that, you know, we all want to be the change we want to see in the world, but it's a really difficult thing to pinpoint because nobody's owning up to the fact that it's them doing it. So it's really hard, and as you say, it's impossible to ignore because it's out there. And again, it's in this idea of a distrust, and you start to distrust society around it. So I think we have to call it out more. I think we need to be pursuing lines of inquiry that call it out more and deal with it, rather than just saying, oh, ignore it, you know, it's a victimless crime really because nobody's really hurt. No, it's really hurtful, and it's lessening the society we want to be part of.
And of course, it's for women politicians, you know, they are putting themselves out there, their voices, their faces, they're very visible, and it's a huge problem for women politicians.
Absolutely. We, as expected, are running short on time, which I knew would happen because we've got such a brilliant panel with so many interesting things to say. But I thought maybe for my last question, we might bring it back to St. Brigid again. Obviously, this is Imbolg, it's the start of spring, kind of at the start now of a new year. And I just wanted to ask each of you, talking about the female voice, what do you think that, I mean, we're not one homogenous group that moves as one, but I'm kind of interested to ask each of you what you think the female voice should be saying in 2022. Emma, do you want to start us off there?
Oh, okay. I guess from my point of view, and sort of personally speaking, mine is about equity and about building equity as much as I possibly can in all relationships. I want to help elevate women. I want to help bring men into the fold. I want to help. I want to platform. I really want us to celebrate who we are together. So I think for me, it's about building equity in our networks, in our environments, and in the society we want to build. I think that's probably as simplistic as I can sort of be about it, but certainly that's what I'm trying to work for, and what we're at the festival, we're trying to build a platform for that and help artists into that space and understand that difference is something that we need to explore and express, because if you tell one story incredibly well, you'll actually tell lots of stories pretty well. So helping people to get that space and tell their story is a fabulous way of knitting us together, even in our difference.
Sorry, while you're mentioning the festival there, do you want to tell people about the next Liverpool Irish Festival if they'd like to go?
A lovely segue, thank you, Ellen. Yes, I would love to. We will be live this year from the 20th to the 30th of October in venues across Liverpool, and we are looking for artists to work with and partners to work with and places to take the Liverpool Irish Festival to. This year's theme is hunger, and we'll be thinking about things like a hunger for nostalgia, a hunger for change, a hunger for power, avarice, all of those things. So not just nutrition, but all of the things that hunger can drive.
Fantastic. Sorcha, can I ask you about your kind of ambitions or aspirations for the female voice in 2022?
Yeah, I was very struck by Emma, and I would absolutely echo and champion your channeling of, you know, that real need for continuing to kind of grow equity. But I also would like to really think about ways in which we can find, through bringing the female voice more to the fore, that we can also create new voices and ways of speaking about things. I mean, we're just talking about social media and that really divisive and kind of bitter kind of form of communication that you can get there, and actually to really channel the spirit of Brigid as someone who was deeply caring, and the great productivity and creativity that comes with that, being caring and empathetic and generous, you know. And I hope that that's something we could all channel a bit more of this year.
Beautiful. And Bethan?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say, you know, women's voices, you know, don't be afraid, you know, have confidence, say, speak, come forward. And, you know, don't feel you have to conform to what you think people want you to say. Just say what you want to or need to say. And also on a practical level, if you know any women, and they don't have to be Irish, who are, you know, experts or good at what they do, at their work, tell them to put their names on the database for Women on Air, and that would be great, because that then means, you know, we have a wider field and range of women who are happy and willing to speak on air.
Brilliant. Thank you all so much. I really think that I think anyone who will have been watching over the course of the last hour can't but help but be inspired by each of the three of you and all of your achievements and all the interesting things that you had to say. And I feel like, were we not constrained by time and being virtually apart, we could have kept that conversation going for a long time. But I think it really was a fantastic way to mark St. Brigid's Day, to honour St. Brigid's and her multitude of talents and ability. And I think that there was a lot of food for thought there that was really, really interesting. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you everyone for watching. And I just want to wish everyone again a very, very happy St. Brigid's Day.